The pain wasn't the first thing she noticed. No, the first thing was the sound. A dry, sandy hiss like seeds shaking in a dead gourd. It was a sound that belonged to the baked earth and the merciless sun. A sound that spoke of death. Then came the pain. It was like two needles of pure fire driving straight through the flesh and into the bone of her ankle. White hot, an instant. Ellen Vance stumbled back, a scream catching in her throat like a stone. Her eyes shot down, and she saw it. A thick, diamond-patterned body slithering away into the shade of a rock. The rattle on its tail was still buzzing, a furious, vibrating warning that had come too late. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was a rattler, a big one. She clutched her ankle, a wave of nausea so powerful it made the whole desert shimmer and twist. Two small puncture wounds were already welling up, not with blood, but with a thin, clear fluid that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The poison was already inside her. "Garrett!" Her voice was a thin, terrified whisper, stolen by the venom and the fear. "Garrett, help me!" He came jogging over from the broken-down wagon, his face a mask of pure annoyance. For 2 years, that had been his only expression when he looked at her. Annoyance, contempt, and a deep, simmering blame for a life that hadn't turned out the way he wanted. "What is it now, woman?" he snarled, kicking a loose stone. "Seen a ghost in the bushes?" She couldn't find the words. She just pointed a trembling finger at her leg, at the 2 weeping holes. "A snake," she managed to choke out. "It bit me." Garrett stopped dead. He stared down at her ankle. His eyes, usually filled with a restless anger, became suddenly still. He traced the faint wounds, the slight swelling that was already beginning to puff up the skin around them. For a long, terrifying moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the buzz of a fly and the frantic, panicked drumming of Ellen's own heart. She watched his face, desperately searching for any sign of alarm, any flicker of husbandly duty, even just a spark of simple human pity. She found none. Instead, a slow, calculating stillness settled over his features. The annoyance was gone, wiped away clean. It was replaced by something she had never seen before. Something cold and appraising and utterly terrifying. It was the look of a man weighing an opportunity. "A rattler?" he asked, and his voice was so strangely calm it made the hair on her arms stand up. She nodded, tears finally breaking free, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, Garrett," she begged, babbling the half-remembered remedies she'd heard men talk about around campfires. "You have to do something. Cut it. Suck the poison out. Please." He looked from her ankle to the endless, empty horizon, shimmering under the brutal sun. Then he looked back at her face, and a slow, cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "I suppose I could," he said softly, his voice a low purr that sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He knelt down in front of her. Ellen felt a surge of desperate, foolish hope. He was going to help her. He had to. But he didn't reach for a knife. His hand went to the pocket of her faded apron. His fingers closed around the small, silver locket her mother had given her. It was the only beautiful thing she had left in the world. The only thing he'd let her keep. He had always hated it. He tugged it free from the fabric and dropped it into his own waistcoat pocket. What are you doing?" she whispered, a new and more profound horror dawning, a horror that eclipsed even the snakebite. This wasn't neglect. This was something else entirely. Garrett stood up, casually dusting the sand from his knees. "You've been nothing but a millstone around my neck, Ellen," he said, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "A bad luck charm from the day I met you. I figure this is the land's way of finally cutting me loose." He turned his back on her. He walked to the broken wagon. He gathered the last canteen of water, the one he had been guarding so jealously, and the small sack of coins that was supposed to be their fresh start. He didn't even glance back. "Garrett, no!" she screamed, the sound raw and desperate. It was a sound that should have stopped any man in his tracks. "You can't just leave me. Garrett, you can't." But he didn't falter. He didn't hesitate. He simply began walking east, toward the faint promise of a town they would never reach together. His figure shrank against the enormity of the landscape, a dark speck against the blinding glare. He walked until he was just a flicker in the heat haze, And then he was nothing at all. The silence he left behind was a crushing weight. It was heavier than the sun, more profound than the emptiness of the desert. It was filled with the frantic drumming of her own heart and the furious, rising throb in her leg. The sun beat down indifferent. The land held its breath. Ellen Vance was alone, left to die. And as the poison began its work, a chilling thought surfaced through the pain. Garrett's calm expression, his deliberate movements. He hadn't seemed surprised by the snake. Not at all. It was almost as if he had been waiting for it. The pain in her leg was a living thing now, a fire that was spreading up her calf, turning the flesh hard and tight. The world was starting to tilt at the edges, the brilliant blue of the sky deepening to a bruised purple. She tried to stand, to crawl, to do anything but lie there waiting for the end. But her muscles wouldn't obey. The venom was a traitor in her own blood, shutting her down system by system. Her thoughts became a feverish soup of memory and fear. Garrett's face sneering at her, the broken wagon wheel, a symbol of their broken life, the constant, gnawing hunger, the thirst that felt like swallowing sand. For 2 years he had chipped away at her spirit. With every insult, every sneer, every casual act of cruelty, he had tried to make her feel as worthless as he felt. He blamed her for his own failures, for his own weakness. He had isolated her, worn her down, until this barren desert felt like the only place she belonged. And now he had finally found a way to be rid of her. He hadn't just left her to die, he had sentenced her to it. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her skull. The heat radiated up from the ground, cooking her through the thin calico of her dress. Delirium began to set in. The sparse, brittle bushes at the edge of her vision started to twist into hunched figures, watching her. The buzzing of the insects grew louder, turning into whispers she couldn't quite understand. She thought of her mother, of the cool green hills of her home back east, a world away, a lifetime away. She clutched at the apron pocket where her locket used to be, her fingers finding only empty, worn fabric. He had taken even that. He had stripped her of everything, right down to her last memory. Time lost its meaning. It was measured only in the agonizing pulse of the poison and the slow, merciless crawl of the sun across the sky. She was burning up from the inside out. Her breathing became a shallow, ragged whisper. This is it, she thought, with a strange sense of calm. This is the end. She had fought for so long, endured so much only to be erased by a snake and the heartless whim of a cruel man. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness behind her eyelids be a final relief from the blinding glare. She felt her consciousness begin to fray, to dissolve into the shimmering heat. The world was fading to a single high-pitched whine. And then something changed. A shadow fell over her face. It was a sudden, welcome eclipse, a reprieve from the relentless sun. Her first thought, clouded by fever, was that it was a vulture, circling, waiting, a fitting end. But the shadow didn't move. It stayed, a cool, dark patch in her fiery world. With an effort that felt like lifting a mountain, she forced her eyelids to flutter open one last time. She wasn't looking up at the sky. She was looking up at the silhouette of a man. He was standing over her, a tall, broad figure, outlined against the blazing sun. She couldn't see his face, only his shape, and in his hand he held something long and dark. Her poison-addled brain couldn't make sense of it. Had Garrett come back? Had he changed his mind? But this man was bigger than Garrett, taller, broader in the shoulder, a stranger. Bandits, she thought, a fresh jolt of terror cutting through the fog. Bandits sometimes used decoys, rumors from the trail whispered. They'd leave a woman to lure in a compassionate traveler. Was she the bait? Or was he the wolf who had found it? He knelt down, his movements slow and cautious. She saw the weathered leather of his boots, the faded denim of his trousers. He was real. He gently moved the arm she had flung over her face. Her world swam into a blurry focus. She saw a face carved from granite and hardship, a thick, dusty beard, eyes the color of a stormy sky, narrowed, assessing. His gaze traveled down her body and stopped at her left leg. She saw his eyes widen slightly. He saw the grotesque swelling, the angry, discolored flesh that was already creeping past her knee. He saw the two dark punctures on her ankle. He knew exactly what he was looking at. A low sound, a guttural growl of fury rumbled in his chest. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the snake, at the merciless land, at whoever had left her here to suffer this fate. Then he reached for his belt, and he pulled out a knife. It wasn't a small whittling knife. It was a Bowie knife, a massive, gleaming blade that caught the sun and threw a blinding shard of light across her face. Ellen's heart seized. This was it. The end. This stranger, this mountain of a man, wasn't here to save her. He was here to finish the job, to put her out of her misery like a lame horse, or worse, to rob her of the last thing she had, her life. She tried to scream, to plead, to push him away, but her body was a useless prison. All she could do was watch in silent, abject terror as he leaned over her, the huge knife poised over her swollen, purple leg. He was going to cut her. He was going to kill her. Amos Blackwood knew the language of death. He had heard it in the final, rattling cough of his wife, Martha, as consumption stole the breath from her lungs 5 years ago. He heard it in the cry of a hawk as it stooped to take a rabbit. He saw it in the stark, sun-bleached bones of cattle that didn't survive the winter. Death was a constant neighbor out here, and he recognized its signature on the woman lying at his feet. He saw the bluish tinge of her lips, the shallow, ragged whisper of her breathing. He saw the venom's work in the violent purple and black that stained her skin. He knew she had minutes, maybe an hour at most, and he felt a surge of something he hadn't felt since Martha died, a hot, protective fury. Whoever had left her here was a monster, a human snake. He knew the folk remedies were a desperate gamble, a prayer against a potent poison, but they were the only prayer he had. He knelt beside her, the big Bowie knife cool and familiar in his hand. He saw the flicker of absolute terror in her glazed eyes as she looked at the blade. She thought he was here to harm her. "Easy now," he whispered, the words rough from disuse. He wasn't sure if he was talking to her, or to the memory of his wife, or to God himself. "I'm here to help." He made two small, shallow cuts right over the bite marks, fast and precise, just enough to break the skin and let the poisoned blood flow. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Then he did the one thing that could save her, or kill them both. He lowered his head, pressed his mouth to her hot, swollen flesh, and drew. The taste was vile, acrid, metallic, the flavor of death itself. He spat the venom-laced blood onto the parched ground, where it sizzled and turned dark in the dust. He repeated the action, again and again. He emptied his mind of everything but this single, desperate task. Draw, spit, draw, spit. The world narrowed to the two small wounds and the poison he was pulling from her body. His own head began to swim. A phantom numbness spread across his tongue. He knew the risk. A small cut in his mouth, a sore on his gums, and the venom would find a new home in him. But he didn't stop. He worked until his vision blurred, until the taste of poison was a permanent ghost on his tongue. He knew it wasn't a cure. It was just a chance. A flicker of light against a fast-approaching darkness. When he could do no more, he rinsed his mouth with the last few drops of water from his canteen, then let a single precious trickle fall over her cracked, parted lips. She moaned, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. It was a sign. She was still in there, still fighting. With a strength born of pure necessity, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile, broken bird. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, her feverish breath hot against his shirt. He turned his horse, spurring it toward the distant, hazy silhouette of his cabin. It was a race against the poison, a race against the sun, a race against the death that was already staking its claim on the unconscious woman in his arms. And as he rode, her head resting against his heart, he felt the cold, hard walls he had built around himself begin to crack. For 5 years, silence had been his only companion, solitude his only comfort. But now that silence was broken by the ragged sound of her breathing. And Amos Blackwood, The man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone found himself in a desperate fight for the life of a complete stranger. For 3 days, the world was a nightmare. Ellen was adrift on a sea of fire, tossed by waves of fever and chills. Her life was a collection of fragmented images, disembodied sounds, and fleeting sensations. A cool, damp cloth on her burning forehead, the gentle pressure of a spoon against her lips, the taste of a thin, savory broth, the first real nourishment she'd had in what felt like a lifetime, and a voice, a deep, rumbling voice that was a constant presence in the storm of her delirium. The words were a meaningless jumble she couldn't grasp, but the tone was steady, a low anchor in the chaos. She babbled, her own voice of strangers. She spoke of Garrett, of a broken wagon, of the terrifying coldness in his eyes as he walked away. She cried out at the memory of the snake, her body jerking with a phantom pain that was almost as real as the original. Through it all, the man was there, a constant, tireless presence. Amos moved about the small, two-room cabin with a quiet, grim efficiency. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever, forcing it gently between her lips. He bathed her swollen leg in cool water, changing the poultices of crushed herbs he prepared from the small, dusty garden his Martha had planted years ago. He sat by her cot through the long, silent nights, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his own exhaustion a dull, heavy ache behind his eyes. He listened to her fevered ramblings, and with every mention of the name Garrett, a slow, burning anger solidified in his gut. He didn't know the whole story, but he had pieced enough of it together. This Garrett wasn't just a husband who had failed to protect his wife. He was something far worse. The name became synonymous with a kind of evil Amos could barely comprehend. He found himself talking to her, or maybe just to the quiet room. He told her about his ranch, about the stubborn calf that always found a way through the fence. He even, in the deepest hours of the night, spoke of Martha. He told the unconscious woman about his wife's laugh, about the way she could make anything grow in this harsh, unforgiving soil. He was tending to a stranger, but he felt like he was tending to the wounds of his own lonely heart. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke. Ellen awoke to the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Her mind felt clear, scoured clean. Her body was a territory of profound weakness, every muscle an aching complaint. But she was alive. She turned her head, the simple movement an act of immense effort, and she saw him. He was standing by the stone fireplace, his back to her, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the soft morning light, filtering through the single window. He was stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. She tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. "Hello." The sound was a dry, rasping croak. He turned, startled. For a moment, she saw a guarded, almost fearful look in his eyes, as if a ghost had spoken. His face was weathered, carved with the lines of sun and sorrow. But his eyes were a clear, steady gray. They held a cautious kindness that she felt deep in her bones. He walked over to the cot, a cup of water in his hand. "Easy now," he said, his voice the same low rumble she'd heard in her dreams. He slipped a strong arm behind her, helping her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. "You've had a rough go of it." She drank the water greedily. It was the sweetest, most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. Her gaze fell to her leg, which was propped up on a stool. The grotesque swelling had gone down, though the skin was still a mottled, ugly canvas of purple and yellow bruises. The wound on her ankle was clean, carefully bandaged with a strip of white cloth. "You?" she began, her voice still weak. "You found me." "By the Palo Verde tree," he confirmed, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Rattler got you." The memory washed over her, sharp and terrible. Garrett's smiling face, the glint of the sun on her stolen locket, his back as he walked away into the shimmering heat. A sob caught in her throat. She pressed her lips together, fighting it back with a will she didn't know she possessed. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She felt as if she had no tears left to shed. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her for details, didn't ask the questions that must have been burning in his mind. He simply nodded toward the fireplace. "Broth's ready," he said. "You need to get your strength back." And so began their strange, quiet coexistence. Her world shrank to the four walls of his cabin and the small patch of dusty ground visible from the window. The man, Amos Blackwood, was a creature of few words. Their conversations were sparse, functional exchanges about food, water, and the slow process of her recovery. He would say, "Leg looks better today," and she would reply, "It feels it." He'd leave a bowl of rich stew on the small table by her cot, and then retreat to the other side of the room, to his own chair by the fire, giving her space and a privacy she was deeply grateful for. He never stared, never pried. Yet in his silence, there was a profound language of care. One day she noticed the tear in her dress, the one she'd gotten on a thorny bush just before the snakebite, had been mended with small, clumsy but sturdy stitches. Another day, he left a book on the chair beside her cot. It was a worn volume of poems, its cover soft with age. The inside cover read, "To my Martha, my whole world, Christmas, 1878. He had given her his wife's book. The gesture was so full of a trust she hadn't earned that it brought tears to her eyes. He never once made her feel like a burden. He treated her with a deep, almost formal respect that was so alien to her after her years with Garrett. It felt like a dream. As her strength slowly returned, Ellen began to take tentative steps. First, just around the cabin, her hands tracing the rough wooden walls for support. Then, out onto the porch, where she would sit in an old rocking chair and watch him work. He moved with a kind of deep-rooted competence, his hands sure and steady as he repaired a harness or chopped wood for the fire. He was a man who belonged to this land, who understood its harsh rhythms and relentless demands. He was the complete antithesis of Garrett, who had only ever sought to conquer and exploit the world, and had failed spectacularly at both. One afternoon, sitting on that porch, she found the courage to contribute. She found a basket of his mending, a shirt with a ripped sleeve, socks worn through at the heel. She threaded a needle and began to work, her fingers moving with a practiced skill that surprised even herself. It was a small, familiar comfort in this strange new life. He returned from the fields at dusk, his shoulders slumped with the day's labor. He stopped on the steps, his shadow falling over her. He simply watched her for a moment, his face unreadable. Ellen's heart hammered. Was she overstepping? Was this too familiar? "My Martha," he said, his voice softer and rougher than she'd ever heard it. She could mend anything. Seemed to think she could mend the whole world with just a needle and thread. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife by name to her, the first real crack in the wall of his solitude. Ellen looked up from her work, meeting his steady gray gaze. "It's a good skill to have," she said quietly. Some things need mending." A flicker of understanding passed between them, silent and profound. He nodded slowly, then sat on the porch step below her, not speaking, just watching the sun dip below the horizon. The silence stretched out, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was shared. The fragile bridge of trust, built plank by plank with quiet gestures and unspoken empathy, was beginning to feel solid beneath their feet. In the middle of nowhere, abandoned and left for dead, Ellen was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. Weeks turned into a month. The angry bruises on Ellen's leg faded to a pale yellow memory, and she could walk without even a hint of a limp. The small, isolated ranch became her sanctuary, a place of profound healing, not just for her body, but for her battered soul. She took over the cooking, her meals a small, silent offering of gratitude. The stews became richer, the bread lighter. She found Martha's small vegetable patch, neglected but not dead, and began to tend to it, coaxing green life from the dry, stubborn soil. Weeding the earth felt like weeding the poison of the last few years from her own heart. She and Amos fell into a comfortable domestic rhythm, a partnership forged in the ashes of their separate griefs. They were two solitary souls orbiting each other in the vast silence of the desert, their paths drawing closer with each passing day. The memory of Garrett began to recede. He was becoming a ghost story, a nightmare she told only to herself in the dead of night. She began to feel a sense of home, a feeling she realized, with a jolt, that she had never truly known. It wasn't in the walls of the cabin or the land itself. It was in the steadfast presence of the quiet, sorrowful man who occupied it with her. It was in the safety she felt when his shadow fell across the doorway at dusk, returning from the fields. One evening, they sat on the porch as they always did, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. The air was cool and smelled of dust and sage. She finally found the words to speak the unspeakable. "He left me to die," she said, her voice barely a whisper carried away by the evening breeze. "My husband. He saw the snake bite, and he just walked away." Amos didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the last sliver of sun was bleeding away. His jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "I figured as much," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Some men aren't men at all." He was silent for a long time after that. The stars began to pop out in the velvet black sky, a million cold, distant witnesses. Ellen thought the conversation was over. Then he turned to her, his gray eyes holding hers in the dim light. "He won't ever hurt you again, Ellen," he said, her name sounding strange and new on his lips. "I won't let him." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't a flowery promise. It was a statement of fact, a vow made of iron and stone. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the West, under a canopy of a million stars, Ellen believed him. She had been found, not just in the desert, but in the quiet, steady heart of a good man. The peace they had cultivated was as fragile as a desert bloom. It was shattered one hot Tuesday by the arrival of a buggy. It appeared as a small, dark speck on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Amos saw it first from the barn, and his whole body went rigid. Visitors were a rarity. Unannounced visitors were a threat. He walked toward the cabin, his boots kicking up dust, his hand resting casually but deliberately near the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Ellen came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the approaching buggy, and her face, which had finally lost its haunted look, became a mask of familiar, gut-wrenching dread. As the buggy drew closer, bouncing over the rutted track, she recognized the man holding the reins. It was Mr. Shaw, the sheriff from Jericho, the nearest town some 30 miles east. A portly man with a weary expression she remembered from their last pass-through. And sitting beside him, looking clean, well-fed, and smugly proprietary, was Garrett Vance. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He wore a new shirt, a crisp bowler hat. He had clearly prospered from her death. A cold, hard fury, an emotion she had suppressed for years just to survive, rose up in her like bile. The buggy pulled to a stop in front of the cabin. Sheriff Shaw climbed down, his joints groaning. "Amos," he said with a tired nod. His eyes flickered to Ellen, and a hint of confusion clouded his face. Garrett disembarked with a flourish, a practiced, grief-stricken smile plastered on his face. "Ellen, my love, my darling wife," he cried, his voice ringing with fake emotion. "Thank God you are safe." He started toward the porch, his arms outstretched as if to embrace her. Amos moved without thinking. He didn't draw his gun. He simply placed his solid frame directly between Garrett and the steps. "That's far enough, Vance." Garrett's smile tightened at the edges. "Mr. Blackwood, I am in your debt. As I told the sheriff, I was attacked by Apaches. A brutal, sudden raid. I was knocked unconscious and left for dead. When I came to, my wagon was gone. My wife vanished. I have spent weeks searching for her, fearing the absolute worst." His performance was seamless. His voice trembled with feigned relief and sorrow. He was the hero husband, tragically separated from his beloved. The sheriff nodded along, clearly having heard this story already. He looked at Amos with suspicion. "He's lying," Ellen said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was steady, clear, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed until that very moment. She stepped forward, standing beside Amos, a united front. She looked directly at the sheriff, past her monstrous husband. "There were no Apaches. There was no attack. My husband abandoned me after I was bitten by a rattlesnake. He stole my mother's locket and our last dollar, and he left me in the desert to die." The sheriff looked from Ellen's resolute face to Garrett's indignant one. He was a man who liked simple problems, and this was becoming complicated. "Now, ma'am," he began, his tone condescending and weary, That's a mighty serious accusation. Your husband here, he registered you as deceased, filed all the proper paperwork, seemed mighty broken up about it. He is a fine actor, Ellen stated flatly. Ask him. Ask him where my mother's locket is, the one he took from my apron pocket as I lay on the ground, dying. Garrett's mask of civility began to crack. A vein pulsed in his temple. She's delirious. The fever, Sheriff. It's addled her mind. Can't you see? This man, he said, pointing a shaking finger at Amos, has clearly taken advantage of her confused condition. She is my wife. By law, she belongs with me, and I am here to take her home. He made a sudden move to push past Amos, to grab Ellen's arm and drag her away. Amos didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood his ground, an immovable object of quiet, protective fury. His body was tense, a coiled spring, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. She's not going anywhere with you. The three words hung in the hot, still air. They were a line drawn in the dust, a declaration of war. Garrett's true nature finally erupted through the veneer of charm. She is my property, he snarled, his face twisting into the ugly mask Ellen knew so well. The law says so. The law doesn't give a man the right to leave his wife for buzzard food, Amos countered, his gray eyes like chips of flint. You can tell the sheriff whatever story you want, but you will not lay a hand on her. You will not take her from this place. The confrontation had reached its peak. It was a battle not of guns, but of wills, fought in the space of a few feet of dusty ground. Sheriff Shaw looked at Ellen, standing tall and defiant on the porch, her gaze unwavering and clear. He looked at Garrett, his face contorted with rage and thwarted possession. And he looked at Amos Blackwood, a quiet, solitary man who was now willing to stand against the law itself for the sake of this woman. The simple truth of the situation, unclouded by stories of Apache raids, settled in the sheriff's gut, heavy and undeniable. He had been a lawman for 20 years. He knew the look of a liar, and he was staring at one right now. But Garrett had been clever. He had filed the paperwork. On paper, Ellen was his. Deceased, perhaps, but if not, then she was his property to reclaim. The sheriff was in a bind. His personal feelings didn't matter. The law was the law. Vance, the sheriff said, his voice hesitant but firm, while this is complicated, the woman is your legal wife. Mr. Blackwood, you need to stand aside. A triumphant, vicious smirk spread across Garrett's face. He had won. The law was on his side. He lunged for Ellen's arm again. Come on, you ungrateful witch. You and I are going home. But Ellen was ready. The fear was gone, burned away by a cold, righteous anger. As Garrett's fingers brushed her sleeve, she spoke again, her voice ringing out with the clarity of a bell. Sheriff, she said, her eyes locked on his. Before you let him take me, you should know what he's truly capable of. That locket he stole, it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. Garrett froze, his hand hovering in midair. A flicker of genuine panic, not just anger, crossed his face. It's a sentimental trifle, nothing more. A picture of her mother. Is it? Ellen challenged, her voice dropping. Then why don't you show him, Garrett? Show the sheriff the picture of my mother. Something shifted in the air. The sheriff's gaze sharpened, moving from Ellen to Garrett's suddenly pale face. He saw the sweat beading on Garrett's upper lip despite the dry heat. Let's see the locket, Vance, the sheriff said, his voice losing its weary edge and taking on a new hardness. This is absurd, Garrett blustered. It's an invasion of my privacy. You're accusing this man of kidnapping your wife, who you reported dead. I'd say privacy is a luxury you can't afford right now, the sheriff countered. Show me the locket, or I'll take it from you. Cornered, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, Garrett slowly reached into his waistcoat. His fingers fumbled as he pulled out the small silver locket. It glinted in the harsh sunlight. He practically threw it at the sheriff. There, see? A picture. Now, can we be done with this nonsense? Sheriff Shaw caught it. The locket felt heavy in his palm. It was old, tarnished at the edges. He worked the small clasp with his thick thumb. It took a moment, but it sprang open with a faint click. The sheriff stared down into the open locket. Garrett held his breath. Amos stood like a statue. Ellen watched, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The sheriff's face was unreadable for a long moment. Then his eyes slowly lifted from the locket and settled on Garrett, and the look in them was one of pure, cold shock. "Vance," the sheriff said, his voice a low, stunned whisper. "There's no picture in here." Garrett forced a nervous laugh. "Well, it must have fallen out during the attack." "No," the sheriff said, his voice growing harder, louder. "It didn't fall out, because this isn't a picture locket." He held it out for them to see. One side of the locket was empty, a shallow, tarnished oval. But the other side wasn't designed for a photograph. It was deeper. And nestled inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a small, yellowed piece of paper. A letter. The sheriff's eyes narrowed on Garrett, the full weight of the law now gathering behind his gaze. "What is this, Vance?" Garrett's composure finally completely shattered. He looked from the locket to Ellen, his face a mask of pure, murderous hatred. "You! You were never supposed to tell anyone!" The sheriff ignored him. With painstaking care, he used the tip of his knife to pry the tiny, folded note from its hiding place. He unfolded it gently. The paper was brittle with age. It was covered in a faint, spidery handwriting. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the rustle of the old paper in the sheriff's hands. He began to read aloud, his voice low and grim. "To whomever finds this," he began, "my name is Sarah Vance. I am the wife of Garrett Vance. He is a charming man to the world, but a monster behind closed doors. We are traveling west to California, but I do not believe I will make it." He speaks of the fortunes to be made, but his eyes are full of a darkness that terrifies me. "He has taken all my money, my inheritance from my father, and tells me it is for our future. But I feel it is for his alone." The sheriff paused, his gaze flicking to Garrett, who was now sheet white, shaking. He continued reading. "He has a temper that comes from nowhere. The smallest thing can set it off. Last week, our horse went lame. He told me it was my fault, that I was a curse upon him. He looks at me now, not with love, but as if I am an obstacle, an inconvenience to be removed." Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. It was her own story, written in another woman's hand. The sheriff read the final damning lines. "I am hiding this note in the only thing he has let me keep, a locket my own mother gave me. He does not know its secret. If I should disappear on this journey, if I should meet with an accident, a snakebite, a fall, know that it was not an accident. Know that he is responsible. Please, for the love of God, do not let him get away with it again." The note was signed, Sarah Vance, June 1881. 3 years before Garrett had even met Ellen. The sheriff slowly folded the note. The entire world seemed to click into place. Garrett wasn't just a cruel, abandoning husband. He was a predator, a wolf who married women with inheritances, took their money, and then disposed of them in the vast, anonymous wilderness of the West. Ellen wasn't his first victim. She was just the first one to survive. "Vance," the sheriff said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, any doubt. It was the voice of judgment. "The story about Apaches was good, but this one," he said, holding up the tiny letter, "this one is better." The color drained completely from Garrett's face. The fight, the bluster, the arrogance, it all evaporated, leaving behind the panicked, twitching fear of a cornered rat. He stammered, he protested, he tried to call it a forgery, a lie concocted by a hysterical woman. But his eyes betrayed him. Everyone saw the truth in them. "Mr. Blackwood was right," the sheriff said, his hand moving to his own hip and unclasping a pair of iron handcuffs. "You won't be taking her. In fact, I think you and I need to have a long, long talk. We'll start with fraud and attempted murder for this one." He nodded at Ellen. "And then we'll move on to the disappearance of Sarah Vance." The law, which Garrett had so confidently tried to use as his weapon, had turned against him with swift and terrible finality. He made one last desperate move, a pathetic attempt to bolt, to run into the desert that he had used as his dumping ground. Amos's arm shot out, catching him by the collar and stopping him dead. There was no struggle. Garrett just crumpled, his energy gone. The sheriff snapped the cuffs around his wrists. The click of the metal was the loudest sound in the world. Garrett was escorted back to the buggy, a pathetic, weeping wreck. His threats and curses and pleas for mercy faded as the vehicle turned and retreated down the long, dusty track, disappearing the same way it had arrived. He had come to reclaim his property. Instead, he had been claimed by his past. Silence descended once more upon the ranch, but it was a new kind of silence. It was cleansed, peaceful. The threat was gone, not just for a few weeks, but forever. Ellen felt the strength that had held her up through the confrontation finally give way. A profound, bone-deep relief washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. She slowly sank onto the porch step, burying her face in her hands. Amos turned and sat beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't say a word, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight at her side, a silent promise that she was no longer alone. They sat for a long time, watching the dust from the sheriff's buggy settle back onto the earth. They listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch, the low moo of a distant cow, the caw of a raven, reasserting themselves in the quiet. "It's over," she said, the words muffled by her hands. It was more to herself than to him. "Yes," he agreed, his voice a low rumble. "It's over." She finally looked up, wiping the tears from her face. She looked at her hands resting in her lap. They were no longer the soft, useless hands of the woman Garrett had tried to break. They were strong, capable, stained with the good earth from Martha's garden. She looked up at Amos. His face was calm, the tension gone, but his gray eyes held a question, the unspoken question of what came next. "Amos," she began, her voice soft but clear, "I have nowhere to go." "I know," he said simply. He finally turned to look at her fully, and in his gaze she saw the vast depth of his own loneliness, and the fragile hope that had begun to take root there, in the garden she had helped bring back to life. "Ellen," he said, speaking her name as if it were a prayer, "you don't need somewhere to go." He paused, and the smallest of smiles touched his lips. "You're already home." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of gratitude, of a profound and quiet joy she had never expected to feel again. She reached out, her hand tentatively covering his rough, calloused one where it rested on the step between them. His touch was gentle as he turned his hand over, lacing his strong fingers through hers. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The harsh, unforgiving land, the place of her abandonment and near death, had somehow miraculously become a place of rebirth. In the heart of its brutal beauty, two solitary souls, scarred and broken by their pasts, had found not just survival, but sanctuary. They had found it in the shared quiet, in the steadfast care, and in the simple, profound truth of a hand held in the fading light. They had found it in each other. The desert that was meant to be Ellen's grave became her salvation. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the deepest acts of cruelty can lead us to the most unexpected grace, and that even in the most desolate places, new life can find a way to grow. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected, and let us know in the comments. What do you think happened to Sarah Vance's inheritance?